I am 90 years old. 90 years. When people hear that number, they usually smile politely and say things like, "Wow, that's amazing." Or, "You must have seen so much in your life." But what they don't see are the sacrifices. They don't see the sleepless nights. They don't see the years spent working until my hands ached and my back felt like it would break. They don't see the tears I cried when nobody was watching. And they certainly don't see the loneliness that often comes with growing old. My name is Walter. 3 months ago, I celebrated my 90th birthday. At least, that's what everyone called it, a celebration. But for me, it became one of the most painful days of my entire life. The day started with hope. I woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight came through the curtains and filled my small bedroom with a warm golden glow. For a moment, I felt happy. I felt grateful. 90 years isn't something everyone gets to experience. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at an old photograph sitting on my nightstand. It was a picture of my wife, Margaret. She had passed away 8 years earlier. Not a single day went by without me missing her. I picked up the frame and smiled. "Looks like we made it to 90. Sweetheart," I whispered. The room felt quiet afterward. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists when someone you love is no longer there. I stared at her picture for several seconds before carefully placing it back down. Then I got dressed. My son, Michael, had insisted on organizing a birthday party. He told me all the family would be there. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, friends, neighbors, people I hadn't seen in years. I was excited. Not because of gifts, not because of cake, but because I wanted to spend time with the people I loved. At my age, time becomes more valuable than money. Every conversation matters. Every hug matters. Every smile matters. As I buttoned my shirt, I remembered all the birthdays Margaret and I celebrated together. Sometimes we had money. Sometimes we didn't. But we always had each other. That was enough. Around noon, Michael arrived to pick me up. "Happy birthday, Dad," he said as he helped me into the car. "Thank you, son." He seemed distracted. His phone kept buzzing. His eyes stayed glued to the screen. I tried to start a conversation. I asked about his work. I asked about the grandchildren. But his answers were short, almost rushed. Eventually, we drove in silence. When we arrived at the event hall, I was surprised by how large it was. There were decorations everywhere. Balloons. Flowers, long tables covered with white cloth. A huge banner hung across the wall. "Happy PY 90 DY Weltar." For a moment, my heart filled with gratitude. Maybe this day really would be special. Maybe I was wrong to feel lonely lately. Maybe my family truly cared more than I realized. Guests began arriving. People shook my hand. Some hugged me. Others smiled politely. Everything seemed normal at first. Then things slowly began to change. A group of younger guests stood nearby talking. I wasn't trying to listen, but their voices carried across the room. "He's 90, one young man said. "No way," another laughed. "He looks like he's about 110. The group burst into laughter. I forced a smile. Maybe they didn't mean any harm. Maybe it was just a joke. Still, the words stung. Growing old is difficult enough without becoming the punchline. I moved to another table. Unfortunately, things only got worse. A woman I barely recognized looked at me and said loudly, "Walter, what's your secret? Still breathing after all these years?" Several people laughed. I laughed too. At least I pretended to. Sometimes older people learn to laugh at things simply because it's easier than showing pain. But inside, something hurt. Not because of one comment, because of what it represented. To them, I wasn't Walter. I wasn't a father, a husband, a veteran, a hard-working man. I was simply an old man, a joke, an age, nothing more. As the afternoon continued, the insults became more frequent. One guest asked if I remembered dinosaurs. Another joked about whether I needed help finding the year 2026. Someone else asked if I planned to live forever. Each comment triggered more laughter, and every laugh felt like another small cut. What hurt most wasn't the strangers. It was my family. They laughed too. My grandchildren laughed. My son laughed. Even some people who knew my entire life laughed. Not one person said, "That's enough." Not one person said, "Show some respect." Instead, they smiled as if humiliation was entertainment. I sat quietly at my table. The room buzzed with conversation. Music played softly in the background. People ate. People laughed. People celebrated. Yet somehow I felt completely alone. I looked around and wondered if anyone truly saw me. Not the 90-year-old. Not the wrinkles. Not the gray hair. The real me. The man who spent decades sacrificing for his family. The man who worked double shifts so his children could have opportunities. The man who skipped meals when money was tight. The man who stayed strong during difficult times. Did any of them remember that man? Or had he disappeared beneath the number 90? A few hours later, the speeches began. One by one, family members stood and shared stories. Some stories were funny. Others were sweet. I smiled politely through all of them. Then my oldest grandson stood up. He grabbed the microphone and grinned. "Well," he said, "Grandpa has lived so long that history books probably ask him for advice." The room exploded with laughter. He continued. "Honestly, we're all shocked he's still here." And more laughter, even louder this time. I felt my chest tighten. I could feel every eye in the room turning toward me, waiting for me to laugh, waiting for me to play along, waiting for me to be the joke, again, and again, and again. Something inside me began to break, not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly, like an old rope slowly unraveling after years of strain. For 90 years I had endured hardships, war, loss, financial struggles, heartbreak, illness, the death of my wife. But somehow this felt different, because pain from strangers is one thing, pain from family is another. Family is supposed to protect your heart, not wound it. I looked down at my hands. The same hands that built houses, fixed cars, held newborn babies, comforted crying children. Those hands trembled slightly. Not from age, from sadness. At that moment I realized something. The people around me saw my age, but they didn't know my story. They knew the number, not the journey. They saw wrinkles, not wisdom. They saw weakness, not strength. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for them to finally understand who Walter really was. Because before this day ended, before the cake was cut, before the final guest left, something was going to happen that none of them expected. Something that would silence every laugh in the room. Something that would change the entire celebration forever. And for the first time all afternoon, I slowly stood from my chair. The room began to grow quiet. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. The microphone sat only a few feet away. And suddenly, every person in that room realized I was about to speak. The room slowly fell silent as I stood from my chair. For the first time all afternoon, nobody was laughing. Nobody was making jokes. Nobody was whispering. Every eye in the room followed me as I walked toward the microphone. My legs were not as strong as they used to be. At 90 years old, every step required effort. But I kept moving. One step, then another, then another. The room was so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner. I could feel dozens of people watching me, waiting, wondering what I was going to say. My grandson handed me the microphone with a smile. I don't think he realized how deeply his words had hurt me. In truth, most of them probably didn't realize it. People often forget that old age doesn't make a person feel less. It doesn't make insults hurt less. It doesn't make embarrassment disappear. The heart inside a 90-year-old man feels pain just as deeply as the heart inside a 20-year-old. I adjusted the microphone and looked around the room. Family, friends, neighbors, people who had known me for decades, people who claimed to care about me. For a few seconds, I simply stared. Then I smiled softly. "Thank you all for coming." My voice sounded weaker than I wanted, but it was steady. "I appreciate every one of you being here today." Several people nodded. Others smiled politely. I paused. Then I continued. "You know, I've heard a lot of jokes today." A few nervous laughs appeared. Not many, just enough. I noticed people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I heard jokes about my age, a silence. I heard jokes about how long I've lived, more silence. I heard jokes about whether I remember dinosaurs. A few faces turned red. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shouting, but suddenly everyone understood exactly what I was talking about. I laughed along with you, I said, at least on the outside. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because that's what older people often do. I looked around the room. We smile. We'll laugh. We'll pretend things don't hurt. Not because they don't hurt, but because we don't want to make others uncomfortable. The room felt heavier now. The cheerful atmosphere from earlier had completely disappeared. I could see guilt beginning to appear on several faces. My grandson looked down at the floor. My son shifted in his chair. I took a deep breath. Then I said something I had never said out loud before. Today wasn't the first time I've felt invisible. The words seemed to hang in the air. Invisible. That single word carried years of pain. When you're young, people notice everything about you. They notice your dreams. They notice your accomplishments. They notice your ideas. But when you get old, I swallowed hard. Sometimes people only notice your age. No one laughed now. No one even smiled. The room was completely still. I looked toward the back wall where the birthday banner hung. Happy 90th birthday, Walter. 90. That number seemed so large, so overwhelming. Yet it represented an entire lifetime. A lifetime that most people in the room knew very little about. You see an old man standing here today. I placed a hand on my chest. But I still remember being a little boy. The room listened. I remember riding my bicycle down dirt roads. I remember my first day of school. I remember my first job. I remember falling in love. A small smile appeared on my face. I remember seeing Margaret for the first time. Several family members smiled gently. Everyone knew how much I loved my wife. Even now, even 8 years after her death. I remember being terrified when I became a father. A few people chuckled softly, not mocking laughter. Warm laughter, human laughter. I had no idea what I was doing. But I loved my children with everything I had. I looked directly at my son, Michael. His eyes were already beginning to fill with tears. I worked 16-hour days. I missed sleep. I missed vacations. I missed opportunities. Not because I wanted to, but because I wanted my family to have a better life. The room remained silent. I remember winters when money was so tight that Margaret and I worried about paying bills. We never told the kids. They were too young. We wanted them to feel safe. I paused. Memories flooded through my mind. Some beautiful, some painful. All real. Many nights, your mother and I sat at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep. We would look at unpaid bills. We would wonder how we were going to make it through another month. My son wiped his eyes. He had never heard these stories before. Because parents rarely tell their children about the sacrifices made behind the scenes. Children see the finished product. They rarely see the struggle. I didn't tell you this for sympathy. I didn't tell you this for praise. I looked around again. I tell you this because every wrinkle on my face has a story. I touched the side of my cheek. These wrinkles aren't something to laugh at. They are proof that I survived. The room became even quieter. If you're lucky enough to grow old someday, you'll understand. These gray hairs. I smiled. They were earned. A few people laughed softly, but this time the laughter felt different. Respectful. They came from raising children, working jobs, paying mortgages, caring for people I loved, losing people I loved. My voice cracked slightly, and suddenly Margaret entered my thoughts again. I could almost see her sitting at our kitchen table, smiling, watching, waiting. I took a shaky breath, then continued. The hardest day of my life wasn't turning 90. It wasn't retirement. It wasn't even the health problems. The room waited. It was the day I lost Margaret. Several guests lowered their heads. I spent 62 years with that woman, and my voice trembled. 62 years. Then one day she was gone. I paused to collect myself. The room remained completely silent. Not a single fork moved. Not a single glass clinked. Everyone was listening. When she died, I swallowed. It felt like half of me disappeared. Tears filled my eyes. I still talk to her sometimes. A few guests began crying. I still look for her when something good happens. I still wish I could tell her about my day. I smiled sadly. And every birthday since she left has felt a little emptier. Now tears were visible throughout the room. Even people who barely knew me looked emotional, because grief is something everyone understands. Eventually, I looked toward my family. My age isn't the most important thing about me. I spoke slowly, carefully. It's not even close. The most important thing about me is the life I've lived, the people I've loved, the lessons I've learned, the mistakes I've survived, the family I've built. I pointed gently toward the audience. That's my legacy, not the number 90. The room remained frozen. Every person seemed to be absorbing my words, thinking about them, feeling them. For the first time all afternoon, nobody saw a joke. They saw a human being, a father, a husband, a grandfather, a man. And then I said something that would completely change the rest of the evening. Something nobody expected. Something that would force every person in that room to look at themselves differently. I tightened my grip on the microphone, took a deep breath, and quietly said, "But there's one more thing I need to tell all of you." A strange feeling moved through the crowd. People leaned forward, waiting, watching, listening, because what I was about to reveal had remained hidden for decades. And once they heard it, nothing about this birthday party would ever be the same again. The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes when people are bored. Not the kind of silence that comes when a conversation ends. This was different. This was the silence of people waiting for something important. The silence of people realizing that the man they thought they knew might be carrying a story they had never heard before. I looked around the room. Faces stared back at me, my son, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, friends, neighbors, people who had known me for years. And yet, in that moment, I realized how little they truly knew about me. Not because they didn't care. Not because they were bad people. But because life has a strange way of hiding certain chapters. Sometimes we keep our deepest stories buried so long that even the people closest to us never discover them. I took a slow breath. My hands tightened around the microphone. There is something I've never told most of you. The room remained still. I've carried it with me for almost 70 years. Several people exchanged confused glances. Even my son looked surprised. I could see him searching his memory, trying to guess what I might be talking about. But he had no idea. None of them did, because this was a story I had hidden from almost everyone. Not out of shame, not out of fear, but because some memories hurt so deeply that speaking them aloud feels impossible. For many years, I convinced myself there was no reason to tell it, that it belonged in the past, that it should stay there. But now, standing at 90 years old, I realized something. The truth deserves to be remembered, especially when it teaches a lesson people need to hear. I looked toward the floor for a moment. Then I began. I was 20 years old when my life changed forever. The room listened carefully. At 20, I thought I had everything figured out. A few gentle smiles appeared. Most young people believed that. I certainly did. I had dreams, plans, ambitions. I believed the future would unfold exactly the way I imagined. But life rarely follows our plans. Sometimes it takes a completely different path, a painful path, a path we never wanted, and yet somehow it becomes the road that shapes us. When I was 20, I had a younger brother. My voice softened. His name was Thomas. A warmth filled my chest at the memory. Thomas. Even after all these years, I could still see his face, still hear his laugh, still remember the way he could make people smile, no matter how difficult life became. He was my best friend. I smiled faintly. We did everything together. We fished together. We worked together. We dreamed about the future together. I paused. Then the smile disappeared. One day, everything changed. The room seemed to hold its breath. I stared into the distance as memories flooded back. Memories I had spent decades trying to keep locked away. There was an accident. No one moved. No one spoke. Thomas didn't survive. Several people gasped quietly. My grandchildren looked stunned. My son froze. I don't think he had ever heard me mention his uncle before. Not once. I swallowed hard. Even after 70 years, the pain remained, not as sharp as it once was, but still there, still real. I remember getting the phone call. My voice trembled. I remember the exact chair I was sitting in. I remember the exact words. I remember feeling like the world had stopped spinning. Tears began forming in my eyes. I remember thinking there had been a mistake. Because that's what grief does. At first, it feels impossible. Your mind refuses to accept reality. You wait for someone to correct the misunderstanding. You wait for someone to say it isn't true. But nobody ever does, because sometimes the worst things are true, and you must learn to live with them. I was angry. The words escaped quietly. I looked around the room. I was angry at life. I was angry at God. I was angry at everyone. Mostly. I was angry because I couldn't fix it. That helplessness had haunted me for years. The realization that no amount of effort could bring someone back. No amount of wishing. No amount of praying. No amount of tears. Nothing. I stopped talking about him, I admitted. Not because I forgot him. Because remembering hurt too much. I looked directly at my family. For years, I carried that pain alone. The room was completely silent. Many people had tears in their eyes now, because almost everyone knows what it feels like to lose someone. Maybe not a brother, maybe a parent, a spouse, a child, a friend. But loss speaks a language every heart understands. Then I said something that surprised even me. The truth is, I paused. My brother saved my life. Confused expressions appeared across the room. People leaned forward, waiting, trying to understand. What do you mean? Someone whispered. I nodded slowly. I'll tell you. The memory felt as vivid as yesterday. There were two people supposed to be in that accident. A collective gasp moved through the audience. Thomas and me. The room froze. Every eye widened. Every face turned pale. That morning we were supposed to go together. I looked down, but at the last minute I stayed home. Silence. Heavy, painful silence. I wasn't there. My voice cracked. He was. The realization spread through the room, slowly. Like a wave. People finally understood. The burden. The guilt. The grief. The secret. For 70 years, I had carried the knowledge that fate could have easily chosen me instead. I spent years asking why. Tears rolled down my face. Why him? Why not me? Why was I still here? No one had answers. Not then. Not now. Some questions remain mysteries for an entire lifetime. I felt guilty for surviving. I admitted. There were days when I couldn't even look in a mirror. My son covered his mouth. His eyes were filled with tears, because he had never seen this side of me. Never heard these words. Never understood the weight I had been carrying. I thought the guilt would disappear, I said softly. But it didn't. Not for years. I paused. Then a gentle smile appeared. But eventually, I learned something. The room listened. I realized that surviving wasn't something I should feel guilty about. It was something I should honor. I pointed toward my chest. But I could make my life count. Those words hung in the air. Powerful. Simple. True. So I worked hard. I became a husband. I became a father. I became a grandfather. I helped people when I could. I loved deeply. I forgave often. I tried to leave the world better than I found it. My voice strengthened. Not because the pain disappeared, but because purpose had replaced regret. And purpose is stronger than pain. Much stronger. Then I looked directly at every person in the room. Every single one. You know what I learned after 90 years? No one answered. They simply listened. I smiled gently. The greatest mistake people make is assuming they know someone's story. The room remained silent. We look at a face. We see wrinkles. We see gray hair. We see age. But we don't see the battles. We don't see the losses. We don't see the sacrifices. We don't see the nights they cried alone. I paused, then added quietly, and we don't see the strength it took for them to keep going. Several guests lowered their heads. Many could no longer hide their tears. The jokes from earlier now felt distant, small, meaningless, because suddenly they weren't looking at an old man. They were looking at a human being who had survived decades of love, loss, heartbreak, and hope. A man whose story deserved respect. A man whose life mattered. A man whose pain had remained invisible. But what happened next would change everything, because just as I prepared to hand back the microphone, a voice suddenly broke the silence. A trembling voice. A voice filled with regret. It was my grandson. The same grandson who had made the joke that started it all. The room remained completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of everything I had shared seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. For several seconds, all anyone could hear was the soft hum of the lights above us. I stood there holding the microphone. My heart felt strangely lighter, not because the pain had disappeared, not because the memories hurt any less, but because after 70 years, the truth was no longer trapped inside me. The secret I had carried for most of my life was finally out in the open. And for the first time in decades, I felt understood. Then a chair scraped against the floor. The sound echoed through the room. Everyone turned. My grandson slowly stood up. The same grandson who had joked about me moments earlier. The same grandson whose words had cut deeper than he could have imagined. His face was pale. His eyes were red, and tears were streaming down his cheeks. At first, he couldn't speak. He opened his mouth, closed it again, looked down at the floor. Then finally, in a trembling voice, he said, "Grandpa." The room remained silent. I looked at him. His shoulders shook slightly. I'm sorry." The words barely escaped his lips, but they were enough. You could hear the emotion behind them, the regret, the guilt, the realization. For the first time that day, he truly understood what his words had done. Not because he was cruel, not because he wanted to hurt me, but because sometimes people don't realize the impact of their actions until they hear someone else's pain. He wiped his eyes, then looked directly at me. I thought I was being funny. His voice cracked. I really did. Another tear rolled down his cheek. "I never meant to embarrass you." The room watched quietly. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Because everyone understood that something important was happening. Something bigger than a birthday party. Something bigger than a simple apology. A young man was learning one of life's most important lessons. He was learning empathy. And empathy has the power to change people forever. My grandson took a shaky breath, then continued, "I've spent my whole life seeing you as Grandpa." A small smile appeared on my face. He smiled too, through his tears. But today, his voice broke again. "Today I realized you're so much more than that." Several people began crying, including me, because those words touched something deep inside my heart. For years, I had worried that my family only saw the surface. The gray hair, the wrinkles, the age. But now, for the first time, someone was seeing beyond that. Seeing the person underneath. Seeing the story. Seeing the life. My grandson continued, "I never knew about Thomas." He shook his head. "I never knew what you carried all those years. I never knew what you've been through." He looked around the room, then back at me. And honestly, his voice softened. I never thought to ask. The honesty in those words hit everyone hard, because many of us are guilty of the same thing. We assume we know people. We assume we understand them. But we rarely take the time to hear their stories. We rarely ask the questions that matter. And because of that, we miss incredible things. We miss wisdom. We miss lessons. We miss connections. We miss understanding. My grandson walked slowly toward me. Every eye followed him. When he reached the front of the room, he stopped. For a moment, he simply looked at me. Then he wrapped his arms around me. The room erupted into tears, including mine. At 90 years old, I had experienced countless hugs from my wife, my children, my friends. But there was something special about this one. Because it wasn't just an embrace. It was understanding, it was respect, it was love, and perhaps most importantly, it was forgiveness. I love you, Grandpa. His voice trembled against my shoulder. I closed my eyes and hugged him back. I love you too, son. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The room watched quietly. Many people openly crying now. The atmosphere had completely changed. The laughter from earlier felt like it belonged to another day. Another lifetime. Because now something deeper filled the room. Compassion. Perspective. Humanity. Eventually, my grandson stepped back. He wiped his eyes again, then looked toward the audience. I think we owe Grandpa an apology. The words hung in the air. One by one, people nodded. Some lowered their heads, others wiped away tears. Then something remarkable happened. A woman near the back of the room stood up. It was one of the guests who had made a joke earlier. She looked embarrassed, deeply embarrassed. I'm sorry too, Walter. Her voice shook. I didn't think about how those comments might feel. I nodded gently. Then another person stood. Then another. And another. Soon, guests throughout the room were offering apologies. Not because they had intended harm, but because they finally understood the difference between laughing at someone and laughing with them. The difference matters. A lot, especially when the person on the receiving end is carrying invisible scars. As I listened, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not resentment, peace. Because forgiveness is a strange thing. Many people think forgiveness benefits the person receiving it. But often it benefits the person giving it even more. Holding on to pain is exhausting. Carrying resentment becomes heavy. And after 90 years, I had learned that life is simply too short for that burden. Eventually, the room settled down again. People returned to their seats. But something was different now. The conversations felt deeper, more meaningful. People looked at one another differently, as though everyone had suddenly remembered that every person carries hidden struggles. Every person has a story. Every person deserves kindness. Then my son Michael slowly stood up. His eyes were red. His face was wet with tears, and I could immediately tell he was struggling to find the right words. For a moment, he simply stared at me. Then he shook his head. Dad. His voice cracked. I don't know what to say. I smiled softly. You don't have to say anything. But he continued anyway, because sometimes the heart needs to speak. I thought I knew you. His voice trembled. I thought I knew everything about your life. He laughed sadly, but today I realized how wrong I was. The room listened. I spent so much time being busy. He looked down. So much time focused on work. So much time focused on responsibilities. So much time focused on my own life. Tears filled his eyes again. I forgot to ask about yours. The guilt in his voice was heartbreaking. I could see years of regret surfacing all at once. Years of missed conversations. Years of assumptions. Years of taking time for granted. And then he said something that stunned everyone. Something none of us expected. Something that would change the direction of the entire evening. He looked directly at me and whispered, Dad, there's something I've needed to tell you for a very long time. The room grew silent again. His voice trembled. His hands shook, and I immediately knew this wasn't going to be a simple statement. This was something deeper. Something personal. Something he had carried inside for years. The entire room waited, watching, listening, holding its breath. Because whatever my son was about to reveal would open another chapter of our family's story. A chapter neither of us had ever spoken about before. And when the truth finally came out, there wasn't a dry eye left in the room. The room was silent once again. Not because people were uncomfortable. Not because they were waiting for entertainment. But because everyone could feel that something important was about to happen. My son Michael stood near the front of the room. His hands trembled slightly. His eyes were filled with tears. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The words seemed trapped somewhere between his heart and his throat. I watched him quietly. No pressure, no judgment, just patience. At 90 years old, I had learned that some truths take time to come out. Sometimes years, sometimes decades, and sometimes an entire lifetime. Finally, Michael took a deep breath, then looked directly at me. "Dad," his voice cracked. "I'm sorry." The words were simple, but the pain behind them was enormous. He lowered his head, then continued. "I'm sorry for all the years I thought there would always be more time." The room remained perfectly still. Every person was listening, because deep down, many of them understood exactly what he meant. Most people live as though time is unlimited. We postpone conversations, delay visits, ignore opportunities, assume tomorrow will always come, until one day we realize tomorrow isn't guaranteed. Michael wiped his eyes. "When Mom died," his voice trembled, "I should have been there more. I felt my heart tighten." He continued. "I knew you were lonely. I knew you were hurting. I knew you missed her every single day." Tears streamed down his face, but I kept telling myself I'd visit next week. The room was silent. "I'd call next week. I'd spend more time with you next week." He shook his head, but next week kept becoming next month. And next month became another year. Several guests quietly wiped away tears, because almost everyone has experienced this regret. The regret of assuming there will always be another opportunity, another visit, another phone call, another conversation, another chance. Sometimes life gives us that chance. Sometimes it doesn't. Michael looked directly at me. "You spent your whole life showing up for me." His voice cracked again. "When I was sick, you were there. When I was scared, you were there. When I failed, you were there. When I succeeded, you were there." He paused. "And when you needed me most," his shoulders shook. "I wasn't there enough." A tear rolled down my cheek. Not because I was angry, not because I blamed him, but because I could hear the pain in his voice, the genuine regret, the sincere love hidden beneath it. Parents understand something children often don't. We rarely keep score. We don't count sacrifices. We don't measure who owes what. Love doesn't work that way. At least not real love. Real love gives, again and again, even when nothing comes back. I slowly walked toward Michael. The room watched. No one spoke. No one moved. I placed a hand on his shoulder, then smiled. The same way I had smiled at him when he was a little boy. The same way I smiled when he learned to ride a bicycle. The same way I smiled when he became a father himself. "Dad," he whispered. I squeezed his shoulder gently, then said something he clearly didn't expect. "You're forgiven." The room erupted into tears, including Michael. He wrapped his arms around me, and for several seconds we simply stood there. Father and son, not perfect, not flawless, just human, trying our best, loving each other. That was enough, more than enough. Eventually, we stepped apart. Michael smiled through his tears, and for the first time all day, I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there earlier. Presence. He wasn't thinking about work, his phone, tomorrow, or next week. He was thinking about now, and that made all the difference. I turned toward the audience. The room was filled with emotional faces. People who had arrived expecting cake, laughter, and birthday photos. Instead, they had received something much more valuable. Perspective. I picked up the microphone one final time. The room instantly became quiet. I looked around carefully, trying to memorize the moment, trying to remember every face, every expression, every tear, because somehow this birthday had become something much bigger than a celebration. It had become a lesson, a reminder, a gift, and I wanted to leave everyone with one final thought. May I share something with all of you? Dozens of heads nodded. I smiled, then began. If 90 years have taught me anything, it's this. I paused. The room waited. Life moves faster than you think. Several people lowered their eyes, because they already knew it was true. I was 20 yesterday. A few gentle smiles appeared. Then I was 30, then 40, then 50, then 60, and somehow I laughed softly. Now I'm 90. The room chuckled warmly, not mockingly. Lovingly, I continued. The years pass whether we're ready or not. The people we love grow older. So do we. I looked toward my grandchildren. Then my great-grandchildren. One day, every person in this room will wish for one more conversation with someone they love. Silence. Powerful silence. One more hug. One more phone call. One more chance to say what should have been said. Many people began crying again, because everyone was thinking about someone. A parent, a spouse, a friend, someone they missed, someone they loved, someone they wished they could see again. So don't wait. The room listened carefully. Don't wait to tell people you love them. Don't wait to forgive. Don't wait to apologize. Don't wait to visit. Don't wait to make memories. My voice softened, because time doesn't wait for any of us. You could have heard a pin drop. Every word seemed to settle directly into people's hearts. Then I smiled, a genuine smile, the kind that comes from peace, not perfection, peace. I spent years wishing I could change the past, I admitted, wishing I could bring people back, wishing I could fix mistakes, wishing life had been different. I paused, then shook my head, but eventually I learned something important. The room leaned forward. The secret to a good life isn't having no regrets. A few people nodded. It's learning from them. It's choosing kindness. It's choosing gratitude. It's choosing love. I pointed gently toward the audience. At the end of your life, nobody cares how expensive your car was. A few smiles appeared. Nobody cares how impressive your office was. More smiles. Nobody cares how many followers you had. A few people laughed softly. What matters is who you loved. Who loved you? And whether you made the world a little better while you were here. The room erupted into applause. Not loud at first, but sincere, heartfelt. Then the applause grew stronger and stronger. Soon every person in the room was standing, clapping, crying, smiling, some hugging each other, some wiping away tears. It wasn't applause for me. Not really. It was applause for the lesson, for the truth, for the reminder that every human being carries a story worth hearing, for the reminder that age is not something to mock. It is something to respect, because every wrinkle represents survival. Every gray hair represents experience. Every elderly person you meet is carrying entire worlds of memories inside them. Worlds most people never take the time to discover. As the applause continued, I glanced toward Margaret's empty seat in my imagination, and for just a moment, I could almost see her smiling, proud, peaceful. I smiled back, then quietly whispered, "We did okay, sweetheart." The applause slowly faded. The music began again. People started talking, but now the conversations were different, deeper, kinder, more meaningful. Guests approached one another and shared stories. Grandchildren asked questions. Parents hugged children. Old friends reconnected. The birthday party transformed into something beautiful, something unforgettable. And as I sat down to finally enjoy a slice of cake, surrounded by family who now truly saw me, I realized something. The greatest gift I received on my 90th birthday wasn't the decorations. It wasn't the presents. It wasn't even the celebration. It was being understood, because every human heart longs for the same thing: to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, to be loved. And that night, at 90 years old, surrounded by people whose hearts had changed forever, I finally felt all four. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel old. I simply felt grateful.